The brain is an organ of places. Different areas handle different functions. There is a motor area of the brain so we can move, a vision area so we can see. Even our most cherished memories begin in specific places in the brain. Now that we know the history behind our journey, we can begin our exploration of this vast and largely undiscovered territory, the landscape of the mind. I wonder what it would be like if I could walk through the brain the way I can hike through Utah. I find the comparison quite striking. The brain has bumps and grooves, the same way this land has mountains and canyons. The brain is shaped by experience over the course of a lifetime, the same way this land is shaped by wind and water over countless lifetimes. One is made of genes, the other, geology. When I compare the anatomy of the brain to the geography of Utah, it helps me understand that the brain is a place. We can go to these places, we can see how they connect, we can even photograph them. There are two areas in the brain that are important in addiction. One is deep inside, the midbrain. The other is on the outside. It's called the frontal cortex. If we landed on the surface of the brain, we would find ourselves walking on the bumps and grooves of the cortex. The bumps are called gyri, and the grooves are called sulci. 500,000 years ago, the primate brain exploded in size to become the human brain that we have today. As the brain grew, it folded on itself, so it had more surface area, and that's why the brain is wrinkled. All of our conscious lives, all of that thinking, feeling, and speaking, everything we see and hear and taste and touch occurs here in the cortex. Our memories are here, carved somehow into the brain, like these petroglyphs left by the Native Americans, or these names carved into the rock by the Mormon pioneers. But the parts of the cortex that we're interested in, the bumps and grooves that matter most to us, are up there in the frontal cortex. It is the triumph of evolution, the frontal cortex. Morality, judgment, personality, all the things that make a conscious, self-aware being are realized up here in the bright sunlight of rationality. It's up here in the frontal cortex where we evaluate the world, where we weigh options and understand consequences. This is where choice is conceived. The frontal cortex is also where we give things emotional meaning. This is the part of the brain where we attach. So this is where a mother loves her child. This is where we love mom back. The frontal cortex is where we select our romantic partners and our friends. This is where we give things moral meaning. And this is the part of the brain where we give things spiritual meaning. It's easy to see how doctors once believed that the defect of addiction was here in the frontal cortex. If this is the thinking, loving, moral, spiritual, social choice part of the brain, then drugs must somehow break the frontal cortex to create all that nasty addictive behavior. It's a powerful idea that drugs work in the frontal cortex and that addiction is due to a moral failing or a personality disorder or a bad upbringing. There's only one problem with that idea. It's wrong. Addiction does not begin in the frontal cortex, and drugs do not begin their work up here. Where do drugs work? Deeper down, in a far older part of the brain called the midbrain. When we descend into the brain, we go back in time, tracing our evolutionary history down to the ancient survival areas of the brain, the areas we still share with animals, and that we held on to as our species evolved because they were so good at keeping us alive. The midbrain does not think. It does not make choices or understand consequences. It handles the next 15 seconds. It gets us from moment to moment alive. The midbrain tells us to eat. It tells us to defend ourselves, even kill. It fires our sex drive. These are all behaviors that are critical for survival. And to make sure we do these behaviors, the midbrain makes them pleasurable. Ordinarily, the frontal cortex keeps the midbrain in check. It exerts a top-down control over the unconscious survival impulses of the midbrain. But in addiction, this top-down control fails, and the midbrain becomes more powerful at guiding behavior than the cortex. In other words, in addiction, something goes wrong at a level of brain processing long before morals or personality or choice. Now, how do we know all of this? That drugs work primarily in the unconscious survival midbrain and not in the rational decision-making cortex? We know this because of a very famous set of experiments done in the 1950s on mice. The midbrain's role in reward was discovered by Dr. James Olds and Dr. Peter Milner. They found that a mouse will press a lever to deliver a tiny electric current to two very small but very specific areas of the brain, the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. And not only will a mouse press a lever to deliver an electric current to these two areas of the brain, that's all he will do. He won't eat, he won't mate with other mice. If you put an electrified grate in front of the lever and shock the mouse, he won't step off the grate. He just keeps on pressing that lever, ignoring all other survival drives, until he dies. Olds and Milner had discovered the pleasure centers in the brain. Our brains have these same two areas, and the nerve pathway that runs between the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens is known as the pleasure circuit. Later, scientists discovered that a mouse will press a lever to deliver drugs to these same two areas, and again, that's all he will do. He won't eat, he won't mate, he sits on that electrified grate and fries, and keeps on pressing the lever until he's dead. So mice can get addicted to drugs. Big deal. Well, think about it. Drugs produce a very powerful, rapidly fatal addiction in a mouse. A mouse has no personality. A mouse does not weigh the moral consequences of pressing the lever. There are no mouse gangs selling drugs to other mice, and yet, mice can still become addicted. Studies like these dramatically weakened the idea that addiction was caused by bad morals, or a personality disorder, or a bad social or family environment. These things might accompany addiction, but they cannot be the cause of addiction. These mice studies showed that in addiction, the drug hijacks the survival mechanism of the midbrain. Now the drug is in the #1 survival spot. The solution to starvation is no longer eating, it's the drug. And the relief from being burned by an electrified grate is no longer in simply stepping off that grate. The relief is in the drug. The drug and survival are now so close together that as far as its addicted midbrain is concerned, they're the same thing. In other words, the drug and actual survival are indistinguishable. And when that happened, we crossed the line into addiction. Most people, around 9 out of 10, are on this side of the line. They are not addicts. They've never used drugs. They experimented with drugs a long time ago. They occasionally use drugs. Maybe they even abuse drugs. But for those 9 out of 10, the drug is just the drug. But when we cross the line into addiction, the drug is not the drug anymore. The drug is life itself. If the alcohol abuser gets a DUI, what does he do? He quits. The abuser can bring the negative consequences of his drinking to bear on his decision-making, because for him, alcohol is just alcohol. But the choice is not the same for the alcoholic. He wants to quit, he's tried to quit, he's endured catastrophic consequences in his life because of his drinking, but try as he might, he cannot quit, because alcohol isn't alcohol anymore. It's the main way of getting through the next 15 seconds alive. So in addiction, something goes wrong with the very part of the brain we use to tell those things that are good for survival from those things that are harmful. A neuroscientist would call this the brain's hedonic capacity. We can simply call it the brain's pleasure sense.